Hello everybody. So as you probably know by now, I should think, in this series we're looking at a theme called Buddhism through time and space, which I'm sure you've heard. So we're looking at how Buddhism has manifested as it sort of spread and developed and what we can learn from that. And since the new year we've been looking at a sort of movement in Buddhism called the Mahayana, which really emphasised the altruistic, other-regarding aspect of Dharma practice. And we talked a little bit last week also about how it's also got this very rich archetypal element, this sort of imaginal element of lots of figures representing aspects of enlightenment, which is quite powerful imagery. And tonight what I'd like to talk about is, if I can find my notes, which I can't, is a particular ritual that has actually got a very long and important history in Mahayana Buddhism, and which we do here as well, and which we're going to do in this evening next week. And it's a ritual called the sevenfold Puja, which most of you have probably come across, but some of you haven't. So it's really important to just say a bit about what it's about, especially for those people who haven't come across it before, but also for the rest of us as well, because it's always good to repeat. There's a saying, non-repetition is the canker of the spiritual life. So if this is all repetition, well, hey, that's great. Okay. It's not a canker. So yeah, we're going to talk about the sevenfold Puja, which, as I said, it's a ritual. And rituals have got a bad name in our society. We think, oh, it's just empty ritual or whatever. It's quite deeply culturally ingrained, I think, in our society. A ritual is per se a bad thing. A Dharma without ritual would be a good thing. At least that certainly used to be the take. But actually a quite well-known and famous psychologist talked about rational ritual. He talked about how the fact that ritual actually serves a very, very rational purpose. And one of the things, this is Eric Fromm, one of the things he said is that rational ritual is shared action expressive of common strivings, and that it's a way that a community can, as it were, express its solidarity, a way a community can express its shared aspirations, and the way a community can actually come together around those shared aspirations. And actually we see loads and loads of rituals all over the place where that happens, from right coarse ones where the Liverpool supporters sing, "You'll never walk alone." What sort of ritual is that? I mean, there you go, a really powerful ritual. Would the game be the same without that ritual of unity, solidarity among those supporters? Ritual works. Ritual really works on the emotions. It works on the underlying feelings. So ritual really works, and it works at lots and lots of different sorts of levels. So I'm going to talk about the sevenfold Puja. And the sevenfold Puja has actually got a very elevated purpose, as we'll see. It's got a very elevated purpose. It's actually a very advanced practice. Indeed, I think that Sangha Night has recently come out and said he really regrets the fact that he introduced the sevenfold Puja to except to order members, except to people who wear one of these. He thinks it's such an advanced practice, only we should be doing it. So it's got this very advanced element, as you'll perhaps see. But and we can take it at that level because we've all got, I think it would be a great shame if only order members did it, because I think it really moves something that's there in all of us. Actually, it really moves something that's there in all of us. But even if, and it'll work at its own level, but even if we sort of forget that it's this very elevated advanced practice that's supposed to get us almost to enlightenment, then it works at another level as well, because as you'll probably find out, it can be very beautiful. It brings some colour and theatre into our practice, and it is a very, very strong way of expressing our solidarity as a community around certain shared aspirations and shared values. So that's a little bit about the sevenfold Puja. Now, so we can take it at that level as well. I mean, we can take it just at the level of practice that really sort of helps us to, just sort of helps us to unify. It gives us metta for one another. So, as far as I know, to the best of my knowledge, the first occurrence of the sevenfold puja is in this little book, actually, which is very good for weight training. The Avatamsaka Sutra. And the Avatamsaka Sutra spends quite a lot of its 1,638 pages. It spends quite a lot of its 1,638 pages telling us more or less the same thing over and over and over again in all sorts of different ways, using all sorts of different analogies and metaphors and images. And what it says over and over again is that reality is not the way we think it is. Time and space are not the hard and fast realities that we think they are, and that in fact all things exist in a state of mutual interpenetration. Everything is part of everything else. It says everything is part of everything else. If you could go through it and count the number of times it says everything is part of everything else, you'd have a very long list. And the Avatamsaka Sutra is a mind-boggling. It's a mind-boggling document. After a while, you just sort of go numb. It's mind-boggling, which in a way means it's an incredibly successful document because it sets out to boggle the mind. That's precisely what it means to do. It means to boggle the mind out of our little preconceived notions, so that we can open up to the possibility the world is just much more mysterious and much more wonderful than we ever thought, than we ever imagined. So it's all of that, and it goes on, as I say, for 1,600 and something pages. But if we want a really simple little summary, if we want to boil down all the things that the Avatamsaka Sutra says about the interpenetration of all things, we could say that all those hundreds and hundreds of pages boil down to something we talk about in our newcomers class. In a way, it all boils down to the fact that the things we usually see as separate, independent, do not exist in a separate and independent way that we think they exist. Things do not have any lasting, permanent, fixed, independent selfhood, separate from the rest of the flow of constant change, which is this reality that we're part of. And we ourselves do not have any lasting, independent, separate selfhood, independent, separate selfhood, separate from the change that we're all part of. So that's the central message of all those pages of the Avatamsaka Sutra. And it's in that sutra that we first get the sevenfold puja. So why? What's the connection? What's the connection? What's the connection between this idea of non-self, or the poetic vision of complete mutual interpenetration that the Avatamsaka Sutra is giving us, and the sevenfold puja, this little practice of the sevenfold puja that could be written on a couple of pages? So the connection is that the Avatamsaka Sutra gives us a vision, if you like. It speaks, if you like, to the imagination and the intellect. But that's not enough. For a vision, or for knowing to have any effect on us, it has to make a difference to how we live. It has to make a difference to how we want to live. It has to make a difference to our will. And the sevenfold puja is a practice that acts on the will. To change the way we live, we also have to want it. And in many ways, the will is what's most important about us. So according to traditional Buddhist cosmology, we live in the desire realm, the realm of willing. We're creatures of the desire realm, creatures of desire. We spend our lives acting on desire, trying to get what we desire, trying to make the world the way we would like it to be, trying to get the things we want to happen. And sometimes often that desire is selfish, It's all about us. Sometimes it's misplaced in that the things we're trying to get aren't really even going to benefit us. But sometimes it's healthy desire. Sometimes it's desire for things like friendship and meaning in life and a desire to grow and develop. And sometimes it's altruistic desire. Sometimes it's desire that the world should be a better place. But it's all desire. It's not that there's something wrong with desire. There's something wrong with certain sorts of desire, or they bring negative outcomes. But we're always, as it were, reaching forward to the future, trying to get the future to be, trying to make something happen or get something in the future. We're driven by our desire. We're driven by our will. Our will is what moves us forward. So, if we start dividing the human being up into bits, it all gets a bit arbitrary. But we could say, just for purposes of argument, that we sort of consist of head, heart, and, if you like, guts. The head, the knowing, the bit that knows, the bit that thinks, the bit that emotes and feels, and the bit that wills, wants and wills. And if we want to change, the will is going to be what's most important. Because if we read, say, the Avatamsaka Sutra, and we might think we know the truth of non-self. We might think we really know the truth of non-self. The head can be completely convinced. But we might still be completely self-obsessed if our heart and our guts are also moved. Nice entrance. Yeah, so we can, unless it moves our heart and our willing, it's not going to make any difference. The world is full of convinced people, like convinced Marxists who own loads of property, or convinced environmentalists who use as many resources in a year as a small town in Africa. Really great, I mean, on record, really great philosophers with wonderful philosophies who are actually really rather nasty people. Philanderers, nasty to their children, etc., etc. Just knowing doesn't make that much difference. There are also plenty of Buddhists who know all about non-self, or Buddhists, if you like, who know all about non-self, but always seem just as focused on themselves as anybody else. So just knowing ain't going to do it. And we can feel loads of lovely feelings directed to all beings, really warm feelings directed to all beings. Have a real loving heart, but unless that translates into willing to do something about it, it's just sentimentality. So neither the head nor the heart are enough. But if we will to live a life that's in accord with reality, if our guts are propelling us along the path to enlightenment, then we will move towards enlightenment, we will practice meditation, we will practice ethics, and those will work on us. They will help us develop wisdom and metta, and empathy for others. And if we will to move towards enlightenment, we will act in a more enlightened way. We'll act as if we were more enlightened, and that will bring us towards enlightenment. So it's what we will that's important, which is why the Avatamsaka Sutra, which spends hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages giving us a vision for the head of non-self, also gives us a couple of pages of a practice to actually become less about the self, more about the non-self, and that practice is the sevenfold puja. So, yeah, the sevenfold puja is a practice designed to help us to connect with, or open up to, the will to enlightenment. That's what it's about. The traditional Mahayana Sanskrit term for the will to enlightenment is the Bodhichitta. Okay, the Bodhichitta. Bodhi means awakening. Chitta means both heart and mind. Dharma doesn't seem to make much of a distinction between the two. So it's the awakening heart, the awakening mind, the mind that's awakening to enlightenment. often translated as the will to enlightenment. It's translated in the Puja as the will to enlightenment. And for Mahayana Buddhism, the arising of the will to enlightenment, the arising of the Bodhichitta, is what the Buddhist path is all about. If that happens, you've done it. Or at least you're propelled towards enlightenment. If that happens, you're on your way. Until that happens, you're sort of in a bit of a dead end, really. So, for Mahayana Buddhism, the arising of the Bodhichitta, the arising of the will to enlightenment is what it's all about. And it's also what the sevenfold puja is ultimately all about. Excuse me. Got very confused notes this evening. So yeah, at one level, bodhicitta is that will to gain enlightenment. The urge to move towards enlightenment. But it's a particular aspect of that. It's not the urge to gain enlightenment just to be happier or more liberated ourselves. It's the aspiration to gain enlightenment for the sake of all beings. The desire to grow in order to be of more use to others and to help others to grow towards enlightenment. The desire to grow is an expression, if you like, of our solidarity with other beings. The urge to grow in order to be part of a sort of general movement of evolution, if you like. The evolution of consciousness on this planet. So it's not just the desire for me to become more enlightenment, it's the desire for all of us all, to become more enlightenment and to play an active part in that process, both by developing ourselves and helping others. So this bodhicitta we're talking about is so important in Mahayana Buddhism. We're seen as something that exists both, if you like, in us, but also in the universe. After all, we and the universe are not two different things. It was seen as the basis, if you like, for all good qualities that we might develop and all skillful actions that we might do. At times it was seen almost as a sort of a volition, a stream of volition inherent in the very nature of things towards more enlightened states. A sort of cosmic will in the direction of enlightenment, in the direction of goodness, if you like, that individuals that we could align ourselves with rather than having our lives dictated to us by our sort of small ego wants. In other words, it was often seen as something outside ourselves. So, as I said, the sevenfold puja first appears, as far as I know, in the Avatamsaka Sutra. 300 in the Christian era, something like that. But it really got developed. I mean, it's sort of quite universal in a lot of forms of Mahayana Buddhism. But the words that we actually use in the puja that we do come from a text by a chap called Shantideva, who lived in the 8th century in the Buddhist University of Nalanda in northern India, at the time the biggest university in the world. So what we do is actually he wrote a book which is quite big, but we've sort of extracted from that book. The first 3 chapters of that book are the sevenfold puja, and we've sort of got a shortened version of that we do. But the words come from Shantideva's text. So Shantideva didn't invent this progressive sequence of moves, but he really did put it into some very beautiful words. Excuse me. So, okay, how does the sevenfold puja work? Well, the first stage is, if I can find my notes, I give up. The first stage of the sevenfold puja is, we call it worship. I think that's rather misleading, actually. I mean, it's really about offerings. It's about offerings. And we sort of do 2 versions of the sevenfold puja. There's a standard, what we might call the standard version, which you'll find in this puja book. And in that standard version, what the first section does is it uses a lot of imagery around 7 traditional offerings that would have been made to an honoured guest in ancient India. So if you were inviting just the most honoured person you can imagine into your house, you would make these offerings to them. You would offer them flowers, you would offer them food of 2 sorts, hard and soft, you would offer them liquid to drink, you would offer them water for washing, you'd offer them lamps, etc., etc. And these are symbolised, these 7 traditional offerings are symbolised by the 7 offering bowls that we always have on a shrine. We're inviting the enlightened mind into our existence. That's the symbolism. We're inviting the enlightened mind into our existence. And if we're inviting something that we honour, then we offer it good things. We offer it good things. So that's the imagery that in a way runs throughout the Puja, this idea we're inviting the enlightened mind. And that's certainly the first stage of the Puja, is just simply inviting the enlightened mind into our experience. We also use a form of the puja here which uses an alternative bit of Shantideva's puja. And we do that because this idea of offering the offerings made to an honoured guest are quite culturally Indian. They're very Indian. And they include all sorts of things to do with inviting them into a bathhouse and all sorts of things like that. They can seem pretty weird. They don't necessarily ring many bells. They don't necessarily immediately conjure up much emotion with Western people who haven't come across them before. So when we're doing the puja with people who may not have some of whom may not have come across the puja very often before, we use a different part of Shantideva's text. Because as well as the offerings to an honoured guest invited to your house, Shantideva's text also has offerings of natural beauty. So he invites us to conjure up in our mind images of forests and mountains and fruit and flowers and lakes adorned with lotuses. And as it were, imagine ourselves offering all of those as an offering to the enlightened mind. And we include these verses rather than the ones about the offerings to an honoured guest because, well, for 2 reasons really. One reason is that these are images of beauty, natural beauty, that many people in the West find it much easier to relate to than some of the sort of more archetypal stuff in the puja. So very often, beauty is it's often our main connection with nature is often our main connection with beauty. And it's really important that as this first stage, we as it were, beautify our mind. We bring beautiful thoughts and images into our mind. It's as though we are inviting an honoured guest into, say, our flat or our house. And if we were inviting Nelson Mandela, I don't know, who do you want to invite? Sangarashta. Yeah, Sangarashta. We've invited him here. What do? We clean the place. We make it beautiful. We make it beautiful. So if we think of beauty, well, one of the things that we're doing is we're closing the gap between our often rather grubby mind and the beauty and the grace and the nobility of the enlightened mind. We're closing that gap so that it's possible for the one to just sort of manifest slightly within the other. And, if we were inviting an honoured guest, we wouldn't expect them to want to come into a really grubby flat with the ashtrays unemptied and squabbling children. And sometimes our minds are just like that, just like that. They're squabbling children and empty ashtrays and unemptied ashtrays and washing up in the sink. So that's the first thing, is just to make the mind the sort of place that the enlightened mind isn't just going to be repelled by, the sort of mind that can have some connection with the enlightened mind. And the second reason we use this sort of natural beauty in the, if you like, offering section, is that For many of us, it strikes me that for many people in the West, our main experience of feelings of reverence or awe come from our exposure to nature. It's very easy to feel reverence or awe in the mountains, at night in nature. That's when, you know, we realise how small we are, and we realise how mysterious and, if you like, awesome the universe that we inhabit is. And these feelings of reverence and awe are in a way necessary in order for us to be able to invite the enlightened mind. If we were talking about Sangha or Nelson Mandela and inviting him in, and our approach was, well, you know, it's just a chap like me, well, what the hell, you know, sorry, I haven't been able to get any biscuits. You know, we need to have the attitude that this is something better than me. This is something bigger and better than me. We need to have a bit of reverence. We talk about compassion as being what happens when metta meets suffering. Well, I think reverence is what happens when metta meets something we recognise as higher than ourselves. We feel, if you like, metta, but it's that metta that's tinged with respect, with reverence. And it's necessary that we have a bit of that attitude. If we're going to invite, you know, we talk about an honoured guest, well, it's part of honouring, isn't it? That we actually have a sense of reverence, of deep respect for what we're inviting in. We're inviting the enlightened mind in, and it's not just like our mind. It is actually higher than our mind. So we need to recognise that. And then we take that a bit further. We take that attitude of reverence a bit further in the next stage. The next stage is called salutation. And salutation means a respectful greeting. I mean, it's a pretty weird word, isn't it? I mean, we don't use the word salutation anymore. But I'm pretty sure that in ancient India, what this meant was definitely bowing, at the least bowing, perhaps even prostrating. It meant a greeting that really expresses a deep respect for the other. So that's what we're doing in the second section. We move from this, we invite the enlightened mind into our mind, into our space. We make the offerings, we beautify that space, but then we also express the fact that we know, we honour that person, we honour the enlightened mind, we accept that that's higher than us, and we express that almost physically by bowing. In fact, we do express it physically, because between these two stages, we usually chant a mantra. And during that mantra, people will come up and they will make offerings to the shrine. They will bow to the shrine. When I first saw this, it completely freaked me out. So, you know, just a warning to those who've never done this before. It's not very cultural, it's not something we culturally do. It's got nothing to do with sort of bowing to idols or anything like that. It is a gesture of respect towards the enlightened mind, if you like, which is a potential in us, but is much higher than we are as we are now. So for me, this offerings is probably one of the most powerful parts of the puja. People come up and often, in a very sort of comely way, make offerings to the shrine. And sometimes people will do it in unison. I really like doing it in unison with somebody else. I talked about ritual as expressing our solidarity, our sort of unity around common strivings, and there can be something about making an offering to the shrine where you actually do it with somebody else, matching your movements to theirs, which is an incredibly powerful way of just feeling rapport and solidarity with that other person. So very often people will make offerings between these two sections while we chant a mantra. If you've never done it before, there's no obligation to do so. You know, you do it when you feel like it, basically. But for me, overcoming my sort of English resistance to doing that was it was quite a powerful growth point, actually, of getting beyond that and being able to publicly express reverence for something that I accept is higher than me. So that's those two sections with the actual physical offerings in between. And I think it's quite important that a ritual involves body, speech and mind, where we chant, we say words in call and response, we chant mantras with others, but we also use our mind to conjure up the images, and I think that's really important, but we also use our body. It brings all the aspects of ourselves in, which is one of the things that makes it so powerful. We may actually physically bow. So in this salutation section, there's some very, I think, lovely images. One of the images is as many atoms as there are in the 1,000 billion worlds, so many times I make reverent salutation to all the Buddhas of the 3 eras. So as many atoms as there are in the 1,000 million worlds, that many times I bow down. Well, of course, that would take a very long time, actually. If we did them sequentially, that would take a very, very long time. But what most of the commentaries on this practice tell us is, well, actually that's not what it means. What it means is imagine yourself in all the atoms of the universe, and imagine yourself and the whole universe bowing to the enlightened mind. So it's a really quite a powerful image for connecting us with the universe that we're part of, and sort of expressing it through a quite powerful image, this sense of reverence, this sense of deep, deep respect for something that we acknowledge as higher than ourselves. So that's the first two stages. I should say about the salutation, I keep thinking new things to say here, about the salutation section, that it, in a way, it starts big and it works small. So it starts out as many atoms as there are in the 1,000 million worlds. We've invoked the whole universe, and we've got the whole universe bowing to all those people who've expressed the Bodhichitta, who've expressed the enlightened mind, the Buddhas. And it comes down, boom, 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 it comes down to the Dharma, then it comes down to the Sangha. And then it comes down to shrines, or places in which the Bodhisattvas have been. Then it comes down to teachers, actual human beings, whoever we regard as having taught us the Dharma or moved us along. And then it comes down finally, all those to whom respectful salutation is due, all those to whom respect is due. So it sort of starts out at the very top level, the abstract, if you like, and it moves it down to real people. Some of the real people that we may actually be in the room with at the time we're doing the practice, that we actually acknowledge that other people also can be worthy of respect, can be, if you like, to some extent, manifesting the enlightened mind. It can be allowing that, the Bodhichitta, to work through them to some extent. So it's not just about the ideal, it's actually also about people. So that's the first two sections, worship and salutation. And then it moves on to going for refuge. Well, going for refuge, if you haven't come across this phrase, is Buddhist code. And it's Buddhist code for commitment, actually. It's Buddhist code for really making your life about something, basing your life on certain values, the values and principles and guidelines of the Dharma. So if we've invited our honoured guest into our house, I'm going to use Nelson Mandela because he's the only one I can think of, or Sangha. We've said, look, I really admire you, almost to the point of bowing. I really admire what you've done. I just think you're a wonderful person. We've expressed our reverence, our deep respect. Well, reverence, deep respect for another person implies necessarily respect for their values, their principles, the guidelines that they live by. You can't really separate the two. They embody certain principles. It would be impossible to really deeply respect the person and not respect the principles. It would be impossible to respect Nelson Mandela if you were a racist and you thought an eye for an eye was a good principle. Okay? You wouldn't respect him. It would be impossible to respect Gandhi if you thought that, if you were opposed to non-violence, if you thought that violence was a jolly good thing and that the weak should give way to the strong. So respecting a person means respecting their values, their principles, the guidelines they live by. And in the same way, respecting the enlightened mind implies respecting the principles, the values, and the guidelines that are implied, that are embodied in the Dharma. because that's what they are. They are, if you like, the principles, values and guidelines of the enlightened mind, that the enlightened mind has handed on to us. So we commit ourselves to actually living by those, to the extent that we can. That's the logical next step of really respect, using the analogy of respecting somebody. The logical next step is to want to be more like them, to actually want to live by the values they express, that they embody. So we say that. We say, well, I'd really like to. This very day, I go for my refuge. This very day, I commit myself to those values. And at this point in the puja, we chant what are called the refuges and precepts. So we chant the ethical precepts of the Dharma. Those embody the values, the principles, and the guidelines that we want to live by. Kindness, generosity, contentment rather than living in craving, simplicity, honesty, straightforwardness, awareness. Those are embodied in the precepts. So the next step is to say, I want to live like this. I want to live like this. I want to live according to those guidelines and principles. The trouble is that having done that, we almost certainly become very, very aware of how in the past we haven't. Yeah? If we met somebody we just thought was absolutely exemplary, I have this effect. I have this effect from being around Sangha, for example, the founder of our order. If you're around him for long and you think, well, he's a great chap, I'd really like to be more like that, and then you suddenly become really aware of all the ways you're not, and all the ways you don't particularly want to, actually. I really like this and that and the other, So it becomes the gap between you as you have been and you as you'd like to be becomes very obvious. So we need to do something about that. That gap becomes very obvious and we need to acknowledge it. We need to acknowledge that there is that gap. It's the first stage of working on that gap, to narrow it, is to regret that it's existence, is to acknowledge it and regret its existence. And this frees us up to move forward. If we think, no, I'm perfect. Anyone who thinks they're perfect is doomed. Absolutely dead in the water spiritually. The best thing to think we are spiritually is completely ignorant and daft and with a lot to do. And then we might get somewhere. But if the more good we think we are, the more we're probably stuck. So we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge the extent to which we are separated from the enlightened mind, separated from the principles and values that we admire. Now, confession, it's not, we've got one at the back, confessional. It used to be a Catholic church. It's got some sort of quite nasty associations in our culture. We think it's about placating an angry God so that we're not punished or something like that. That's the sort of lowest level of it, I suppose. But it actually is a really necessary spiritual practice if we can sort of divorce it from all those implications. Because when we can acknowledge, own up, fess up, there's a sense in which we're freed. There's a sense in which we're freed from the thing. Until our usual approach to our unskillfulness is to either deny it, or we deny it even to ourselves. We don't even see it, or to justify it. Well, that's all right. It's just human. It's only natural. Anyone would do that under those circumstances. But when we confess, we're actually firstly acknowledging it, so we're becoming aware of it. But we're also admitting to ourselves that it ain't good, and that it would be good to get beyond that. It's really important with confession that we don't get stuck in sort of guilt. It's very important that we recognise where we need to move forward. But it's possible to sort of just get really hard on ourselves. We're conditioned beings. We can only move at a certain pace. And so we may find that there are things that we have to own up to, fess up to, at least to ourselves in confession, that we're probably going to do again next week, And I think we have to sort of work with that. We have to work with a certain amount of kindness to ourselves in confession. That it's our intention to move beyond these things, but We can't do it all in a day. Nobody, we're confessing lapses from the precept. None of us here, not one of us here, lives according to the precepts. It's undoable unless you're enlightened. It's absolutely undoable. Who's got perfect generosity or perfect awareness? Perfect kindness. So, we don't want to start beating ourselves up, but we do want to acknowledge where we need to move forward. It's quite an interesting thing in Buddhism, the difference between, sometimes it's translated as shame, as a positive mental state. So recognizing where we fall down as a positive mental state, but there's also a sort of negative guilt, which is a very negative mental state. Anyway, so that's confession. We need to just say, okay, I see where I'm separated from it. I see where I don't do this. I see where I don't live according to these values and principles that I value, that I admire, that are represented by this enlightened mind that I've invited in. But then we move on to the next point. Rejoicing. So we need to acknowledge where we fall down, but we also need to rejoice in where we don't. We need to rejoice in the ways that we actually do act according to the Bodhichitta, if you like, to the enlightened mind, the ways we act in a positive way, the ways we and others do. And this hopefully this will get rid of any of that sort of negativity from the confession stage. So we rejoice with delight in the good done by all beings. In other words, we rejoice in all the manifestations of the enlightened mind, if you want to see it like that. It's like it comes through, it glimmers through people all the time. And we're rejoicing in all those glimmers that we see, in just the ordinary good things that people do in their daily lives. So we start at that level. But whereas the salutation, we start at the top and move down to actual people. Here we start with the good done by actual people, those glimmers of the enlightened mind that all sorts of people all over the world are always showing. And we move from that right up to the abstract. I rejoice in the arising of the will to enlightenment and the teaching, those oceans that bring happiness to all beings. So right up to the enlightened mind itself. And I think this is a really important point in the Puja, because we've sort of moved, the sequence is we've invited the enlightened mind in, like the honoured guest. We've expressed our reverence, our respect. We've said, I'd really like to live according to the principles and the values and the guidelines that you manifest, acknowledged where we don't. And now we're actually moving on a stage further in our identification with the enlightened mind. Previously it's been something that's quite separate from us, but now, as it were, we're joining the enlightened mind's team because we're rejoicing in its successes, okay, wherever they occur. If we support a football team, we rejoice in its successes. If there's something we're part of, we rejoice in its successes. If there's a firm that we work for, we rejoice, and we really identify with it. We rejoice in its successes. If we play for, say, a sports team, then we don't only rejoice when we score a goal, we rejoice when Fred scores a goal or whoever, So there's something about, we're now part of something bigger than ourselves, and we can rejoice in all its successes, or we can rejoice in all the good in the world. It's not just about my spiritual progress. I can rejoice in any manifestation of spiritual progress anywhere. So I'm sort of identifying more with the enlightened mind. We move on from that to entreaty and supplication. And basically what we're doing here is we're asking for teaching. We've got to the point where we're sort of saying, well, okay, I'd really like to open up this, but I need teaching. It's an expression of receptivity. It's an expression of willingness to be taught. It's an expression, if you like, of willingness to get our small self out of the way to make way for something bigger. So we're expressing a sort of openness to be taught, an openness to be influenced. And at this point in the puja, after the entreaty and supplication, we usually have a reading. And it's a reading from the Buddhist canon. So we get, we ask for a teaching, and we get a teaching. We get a teaching from the Buddhist canon. And then we chant, bizarrely, the Heart Sutra in unison, which you'll find completely strange if you've never done this before, because everybody seems to know it. How did they know it? Well, that doesn't matter, just listen to it. It's enigmatic, you're not supposed to understand it. It's meant to sort of boggle the mind, a bit like the Avatamsaka Sutra. In a way, what it's saying is, well, I don't know what it's saying. I'm not going to try and sum up the Heart Sutra. To me, it's one of those things that, when you first hear it, you think, what on earth does it mean? But I'm sure it's really deep. I actually know somebody whose first exposure to the Dharma was going to somebody's ordination, and they heard the Heart Sutra, and that got them into the Dharma. They just thought, there's something in there that is so important, I've got to find out what it is. And they ended up getting ordained themselves. So it's as though you don't necessarily have to understand it with the rational mind to sort of just clock, there's power here, there's something in this. So that's the Entreaty and supplication. And then we move on to the final stage, the culmination of the sevenfold puja, which is the transference of merit and self-surrender. So transference of merit, there's a sort of metaphor that's used in traditional Buddhism, that when we practice we gain merit. And merit is a bit like spiritual power, or even spiritual currency. Merit makes good things happen. So with that sort of metaphor, it's possible to practice the Dharma from completely selfish motives, okay? So I am going to gain merit, I'm going to be generous, because that will mean I gain merit, and then I'm going to get loads of riches. Or, it's a way that you could see practicing the Dharma in quite selfish terms. Or I'm going to practice the Dharma so I get a better rebirth. It's all about me. So the Mahayana, with its emphasis on practicing for others, comes along and says, hey, yes, when you practice the Dharma, when you do the sevenfold puja, for example, you get merit. But what you've got to do is not hang on to that. You've got to give it away for all beings. You've got to give it away to all beings. But of course, there's a catch-22 in this, because when you give away merit, you get even more merit back because it's so generous. But it's basically a metaphor for saying, I'm not just practicing for me. I'm accumulating this spiritual power, these positive qualities, but not just to make me happier. I'm giving them away. I am making the world. I use them to make the world a better place, to help other people. So that's transference of merit. And then finally, self-surrender. And self-surrender really is the final stage of the puja. It's the point where, if you like, having invited Nelson Mandela into our house and done all these things, blah, 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 we end up saying, hey, can I come and work for you? I give myself to you. I don't even want very many wages. You're giving yourself to the enlightened mind. You're expressing the desire to allow the enlightened mind to act through you, to get yourself out of the way and act through you. So the version that we often use, we say, may I be the doctor, may I be the nurse for all beings until the world is cured. May I be a light for those that are lost. May I be a harbour for those that need shelter. And you express your desire to move towards Buddhahood, to practice the Buddhist path, to do that. In the version that's in the Puja book, it's even more extreme. It says, my personality throughout my existences, my possessions and my merit in all three ways, I give up without regard to myself for the benefit of all beings. So there's a potential problem here that we can't honestly say these words. How many of us honestly can say, I give up all my possessions, I give up my personality, take them. And I suppose that could sort of cause a bit of how can I say this? Even may I be the doctor, may I be the nurse for all beings until the world is cured. But certainly I give up all my possessions. And I think it's important to recognise that what's going on here is that we're rehearsing. We're rehearsing giving ourselves to the enlightened mind. All of us can't want to do that at the moment. It's like we're playing at being a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is somebody who's motivated by the bodhicitta, the enlightened mind. And we're rehearsing being a bodhisattva. It's as though it's like with kids who put on clothes that are way too big for us. We dress up as our mum or our dad, and putting on clothes that are much too big. This is like play. Play and rehearsing has got a really important function. Kids play in order to develop certain qualities, in order to rehearse things that are potentials in them that are going to express later. They get those potentials out. So they might be developing the potential for bravery by playing at war, or they might be developing a potential for nurturing by playing with dolls or something. All sorts of things like that. We develop all sorts of potentials by play. That's how we develop potentials when we're kids. And in a way, that's what we're doing. We're sort of pretending, we're acting as if we're giving that part of ourselves that would like to say those words a rehearsal, an opportunity to express itself. And as we do that, well, over time that just becomes stronger. It becomes a more and more part of ourselves, because it is a potential within us. So that's, as it were, the culmination of the puja. We do express these words where we're just giving ourselves. We're giving ourselves to what's positive in the universe, expressing a desire to get out of the way, get our small self out of the way, and allow that to act through us. And in the version we often use, we liken that to spreading out a feast for all beings, where we say, what do we say? I haven't got to say.
I invite the world to a great feast.
I invite the world to be my guest at a great feast of delight. So it's an act of generosity, but it's an act of generosity that's really happy one, like giving a big party. Yeah? It's not a sort of doer. And then, having done that, we chant some mantras. We conclude the thing by chanting some mantras. So we're chanting mantras. Mantras are sound symbols of enlightened beings, aspects of enlightenment. So in a way, what we're doing is finally invoking, if you like, actual manifestations of this enlightened mind that we have given ourselves to, at least in our imagination. So we do that, and it ends with these three shantis. Shanti, shanti, shanti. Peace, peace, peace. And very often, at the end of a puja, there is a palpable sense of something mysterious happening, a sense of calm, silence, and unity of purpose in the room that is really quite moving. I remember the puja at the end of the urban retreat back in the beginning of last year, where we've chanted those final mantras, then nobody moved for about 15 minutes or something. It went on and on. It's total silence. It can be a really good time to to meditate, for example. I mean, those three shantis are meant to invoke this deep silence of the enlightened mind, the deep peace of the enlightened mind. And sometimes it really seems to work. I mean, Sangha has said the Bodhichitta, the enlightened mind, is more likely to arise among a community of people acting together than it is in an individual. And you almost get a taste of that. You almost get a taste of something having arisen among us at the end of a puja, which is, to me, inexplicable. So you can't really... When I first came across the puja, I thought it was just weird. Completely strange practice. I mean, to the cerebral mind, to the rational mind, it's a pretty strange thing to do. But I'd invite you not to judge it on that basis, but to give it a go. Because one of the things about it is, it just seems to work. People over and over again talk about, well, being quite strange about it at first, but over and over again, I've heard people say about how they were a bit negative, a bit down, a bit this, a bit that. They took part in a puja and it totally transformed it. Give it a go. Give it a go if you haven't come across it before. Because... you know, the proof is in the eating. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. It really does change mental states. So give it a go. And we'll be doing one next week, and I hope that's explained a little bit of what it's all about.